Gary, so good to be here with you. Thank you so much for taking the time.
My pleasure, Ricardo. Pleasure to be here, and it's an honor.
So, first of all, because we've already done the intro, so people know who you are, I wonder, can you take us back to that Gary from 1984 when you started? Is it PICO?
It was PICO.
PICO Engineering. Actually, I want to go further back because I'd like to know how you actually got into the mindset to start PICO in the first place.
Yeah. Well, you got to look at what my motivation was all along. I grew up in New York City in the projects, went to public school. Actually, the high school I went to, Samuel J. Tilden, was riddled with race riots because Al Sharpton was in that school and in my class at the time. And he was just somebody that caused a lot of strife and difficulty in that school. So I didn't get a very good education coming out of Samuel, J. Tilden. Then later on, a few years later, I went to college. The first year of college, I went to C.W. Post or LIU on a probationary basis because my grades in high school were just not very attractive. I got straight A's in engineering at LIU, was able to transfer to Columbia University. I had lost my parents years earlier. My dad had left my mom and my sister and I when I was 7 years old.
Wow.
Never really saw him after that, but maybe once or twice. He passed when I was 12. My mom passed when I was 16. So my motivation to get out of the projects was not a matter of, well, I want to be very rich. I want to be successful. It was more a motivation of survival. So without having any family, without having any parents, with only having an older sister, I knew the only ticket for me out of the projects and out of Brooklyn was to get a good education. So I ended up at Columbia University School of Engineering, where I worked hard, graduated top of my class, and I was offered a fellowship to stay on at Columbia and earn a PhD. But at that time, I was on fumes. I had no money left to speak of. I was there on a scholarship and a lot of social welfare programs that helped me get through school. And that money had run out when I got my bachelor's degree.
Take me back to the projects, that caught my attention because, we're the average of the 5 people we spend the most time with. You know that, right? And you might know it by now. In the projects, you were probably not surrounded by the best examples. Like, what was the driving force behind you reaching this first sort of inflection point?
Well, I always wanted to, I was always a tinkerer when I was a kid. I was always taking things apart, putting them back together, finding spare parts and building things. So at an early age, I knew I wanted to be an engineer. I wanted to build things. I wanted to create things. So I was very motivated to see that career goal come to fruition. So the people I grew up with, none of them had my kind of success. A lot of them died from drugs and overdoses. Some of them ended up in prison. It was a rough neighborhood, but it was a neighborhood that had a lot of camaraderie and a lot of family values. So we all kind of had each other's back in that neighborhood. To this day, I'm still friends with a lot of the kids I grew up with in the projects. And it was a very tight-knit group. Back in those days, we didn't have as much guns on the street, so we weren't dying by gun violence like nowadays. There was violence, but it was just, when you left the house in the morning, you didn't wear shorts and sandals because you knew you might have to fight or run. So, you wore sneakers and long pants and you were always prepared. I would travel to go to Columbia. I would travel on a bus and 2 subways. It would take me an hour and a half each way every day to get up to Columbia from where I lived in Brooklyn. So it was quite a schlep, if you know what that terminology means. It was quite a journey. So I was always motivated to get out of the projects and to become an engineer. The other kids I grew up with didn't have that same aspirations. And some ended up as school teachers, some ended up as taxi cab drivers and truck drivers, and some ended up in rehab or prison. But I got out of the projects through my education. When I was in the chairman of the department's office and he offered me a scholarship, I said, no, Professor DiMaggio, I don't need a fellowship. I need a job. He made one phone call. I got a job with IT&T with an alumni from Columbia. And that started my journey onto success. But back in those days, it was 1977. I was making $11,000 a year. I was happy to get it. And it was a wonderful stepping stone. From there, I went on to go work for Stone & Webster Engineering, building nuclear power plants. From there, I returned to Florida. No, actually from there, I ended up in Vail, Colorado, working for a Columbia alumni again, building a ski resort called Beaver Creek, which a lot of your listeners probably know. So I was the engineer in charge of building the village hall or the base camp, plus a lot of the infrastructure in Beaver Creek. And after we built the inner core of Beaver Creek, Vail Associates at the time, not Vail Resorts, got out of the development business. And they pretty much sold their real estate company and stopped doing development. Another company took over all that development called East West Partners. And I returned to Florida many years later, I went back to Vail as a volunteer, mountain host, cookie man, and I've done that for the last 5 years.
I saw that, the Cookie Man.
Yes.
So going back, did you ever find a mentor in anyone? Like I'm looking for that place where I know you definitely, by looking at your surroundings and the projects, you wanted something better. You took stuff apart. And by the way, I did that. All my toys were taken apart. So we share the same thing. I guess we both went to the right school, right?
Yes.
But walk me, how did you pay your way through Columbia?
Well, there was a program that still exists today. It's called the Department of Vocational Rehabilitation. And it's a program that a lot of people don't know about, but it came out of, the social programs of New York State. And my sister and I both got a scholarship with the Department of Vocational Rehabilitation. And whether it was because of my upbringing or it was because we had some medical conditions, my sister was diabetic, I had asthma, we were able to get our tuition paid for 100%.
Wow.
And our books paid for 100%. However, I had to, pay for my housing and all that. And I had veterans benefits from my father. Mm-hmm. I had Social Security from my father and my mother. So the rent in the projects was $99, it was $75 a month back in those days. So we were able to get by, my sister and I.
I'm an immigrant, Gary. I came from Venezuela 22 years ago. And you say that story, and I've always believed that this is the country of opportunity. It's not just about the American dream. But I think that anyone, if you're willing to work hard, I think this country has plenty of opportunities for people that are willing to work hard. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I actually, for 35 years, I interviewed a lot of prospective candidates that want to go to Columbia. And I don't know how many times I heard from prospective candidates that they couldn't afford to go to the school and that their parents didn't have the money for it. And I take them back to my story. I had no money. If there's a will, there's a way.
If there's a will, there's a way.
There's so many resources to find the money you need for school. Besides, student loans, there's so many programs out there you could apply to find the resources to go to college. And if that doesn't work, the school will give you financial aid. Mm-hmm. And that's why it led me to, many years later, to set up a scholarship at Columbia Engineering School for inner city kids, similar background as mine, that just need not a handout, but a leg up. So that scholarship's still in place. I get to review who's applying for it every year.
What's it called?
And it's the Elzweig Family Scholarship at Columbia.
How do people apply for it? Do they get selected from like their grades, or do they have to apply for it?
They have to apply for it. And it's through the engineering school.
Okay. Directly with the engineering school.
Okay. And it basically pays for most of their tuition. Okay. And that's just off the earnings of the money I gave them. They never touched the principal, and it's grown considerably over the years. I started that back 20 years ago. And I've added to it over the years.
That's amazing.
So there's always a way to get through college. So now fast forward, I've left Vail Associates after Vail Associates got out of the business. They went through an IPO, became Vail Resorts, and I went to Florida, started my first business, which was called PICO Engineering.
So that was back in 1984. So you worked, when did you graduate? Columbia?
1977.
Okay, so from 77 to 84, you worked at Vail Resorts, or what was Beaver Creek at the time?
No. From 77 to 79, 80, I worked for it.T Community Development Corporation, building Palm Coast. After that, I went to work for Stone & Webster Engineering, building nuclear power plants. That was back in the days when we were building nuclear power plants. Stone & Webster was one of the biggest in that space. Learned an awful lot working for those guys about power plant construction, nuclear engineering. It was a phenomenal experience. Got recruited back to work for my boss over at it.T. He was now with Vail Associates. He was the president of Beaver Creek Development Corporation. I went to work for him as one of the engineers in charge of building Beaver Creek. So I stayed there for a number of years, blew my knee out a few times from skiing, and said, I'm going to go to Florida to do some scuba diving. Ended up Florida, started my first business called PICO, ran that for 20 years. And we were pretty much a very strong regional firm in Southeast Florida. I merged it with a company called US Labs.
Gary, before we
First,
go there, because I think it's first of all, it's interesting how you transitioned from the corporate world, working with AT&T, building Beaver Creek and the other construction company. Like what made you go out on your own? Because it takes guts to go out on your own. You started from scratch, right? You started PICO from scratch, which by the way, it stands for Professional Engineering and Inspection Company.
yes.
How was that beginning for you? Did you not have to become someone else when you became an entrepreneur?
Here's what happened. There was a collapse in Florida in Cocoa Beach. A bunch of shoring and reshoring came down on a high-rise condominium. And the shoring came down because it wasn't properly designed and it wasn't properly erected. So the state of Florida passed what was known as the threshold building law. And to build those kind of structures, any structures over 3 stories or with an assembly occupancy of over 5,000 persons, you had to have a threshold building inspector that is certified by the state. And to get certification, you had to prove structural engineering competency as far as design and inspection. So there were virtually very few engineers in the state that had that qualification. I had it because of my education in structural engineering and my experience with working on nuclear power plants. I had both the design and the inspection experience. I was one of the first to get that license in the state of Florida, which kind of created a barrier to entry in this space, and it was in high demand. I first started consulting for another firm, Florida Testing, an inspection company, kind of lending them my license and overseeing their high-rise work. And then I said, why am I doing it for these guys and waiting to get paid so long? So myself and another engineer, Mark LeBlanc, started at PICO. And PICO did very well. We captured the market in these services in South Florida. We expanded into construction materials testing. Really loved running my own business and growing it. Grew it to about 10 million in volume and merged after 20 years, merged with a company. Hurricane Andrew hit.
1992, right?
1992, August 1992. And all our clients, related companies, Lennar Homes, all our big clients got slammed by the storm. So we were in a position where we had to do a lot of assessments, structural assessments, habitability assessments on a lot of their properties. We had to do assessments for insurance companies, adjustment, because insurance adjusters couldn't get out there. So insurance companies would accept our reports. And we were working 24/7 after Hurricane Andrew, and we were busy. I couldn't hire fast enough to keep up with the work. So we were making a lot of money. I actually hired my old mentor that I worked for at IT&T and Beaver Creek. He came to work with me, brought him in to help us with the workload. So it was a great milestone to be able to hire my mentor.
How old were you at the time?
I started
Your 20s, right?
I was in my 20s, and we were making a lot of money as a result of Hurricane Andrew. After that, we were all a little burnt out when things stabilized, and we looked for opportunities to kind of merge or grow the firm or create a liquidity event. We ended up finding a company called US Labs that was run by a gentleman named Dick Wright, who became a mentor of mine and a close friend over the years. We were he just left a company called PSI, and he was looking to start his own kind of roll up in the engineering space. We were his first acquisition. I became the number 2 guy in the company, obviously. And we decided in 1997 to take the company public.
Before we go there, this was your first exit, right? So PICO, technically, they bought out how many shares did you sell to US Labs?
They bought 80% of the company.
Okay.
And if I told you what I sold for, and I'm still sick of what I sold for, because back in those days, there were no buyers. It was the financial guys were not in the space. Nobody was buying engineering firms. They were buying pets.com. It was the .com bubble days. Nobody was looking for meat and potatoes companies. So there were few ways to exit an engineering business other than an ESOP, which is one of the worst ways to exit because you're financing your own exit. So we found a company called US Labs, Dick Wright. We ended up selling 80% of the business. I had 2 partners at that time. They had retired. I stayed on, rolled my equity.
Mm-hmm.
So I ended up with 20% of US Labs. We grew that through a few acquisitions.
Can you are you able to state how much? I know you mentioned it kind of makes you sick, but are you able to share how much you sold for?
Business was doing 10 million in volume, probably generating 3 million in EBITDA and we sold 80% of it for $1.5 million.
That
Peanuts.
that was your first learning opportunity. We'll go. By the way, we'll come back to it because I'd love
My
to get your
my
perspective today
yeah
of those deals in the past. You know,
yeah, my advice to young entrepreneurs is hire the best advisors, the best law firm, the best financial advisors, and make sure you get the right value for your business. Okay,
absolutely.
or like you, the right investment banker or right broker.
Did
Make
you
sure you
did
get.
you
I
not
had no
use?
broker.
You
I
had
had
no one.
no one. I did it myself.
Okay. Okay. So they basically you were basically dealing with a knowledgeable buyer at the time, although at the time, I guess your interest was just in acquiring, not necessarily a savvy buyer, or were they a savvy buyer, would you say?
They were a very savvy buyer,
Okay.
and he had a very good lawyer, and I didn't have such a good lawyer. I
But at
learned
the
that
same
lesson.
time,
But
maybe,
at the same time, at the
yeah,
end of the day, 3 years later, we went public in 97, and this is before Sarbanes-Oxley. So the regulations weren't as fierce as they are today. We went public. Our valuation, we probably had 11 million in revenue at the time. So it was a very small, we were on the NASDAQ small cap. We made a few acquisitions. I eventually exited, and I ended up with $8 million for my 20%, where I sold 80% for 1.5. A few years later, I sold my 20% for $8 million.
see,
So
that's where you get your
so
payback.
dynamic of taking a liquidity event, keeping some, chips on it, in play, keeping some money in play and rolling it is a very dynamic way to create wealth.
Gary, did you feel that, like, at the time when they bought you, like when US Labs came on board, did you feel that they changed your perspective and maybe, raised that glass ceiling where you probably never thought you were going to exit at that point? Or did you think that you were going to be able to exit at those levels?
No, what that experience taught me was how to treat your business like a commodity as opposed to a family member.
Huh.
And
Tell,
to
tell me more. What does that mean?
in other words, use that value of that business to trade up. And that's what I learned. I learned one, Dick Wright was very good at acquisitions. And I did the acquisitions with him. And I learned an awful lot about buying other companies and then integrating those companies and creating a lot of value through multiple expansion. Certainly we had EBITDA growth, but we had phenomenal multiple expansion from
When
selling
when
at
you say
maybe.
multiple expansion, how did you achieve, like, what was the main ingredient to you gaining that multiple expansion?
The main ingredient was acquisitions. The more revenue you have and the more EBITDA you have, you start to hit different benchmarks from let's say under 5 million in EBITDA, you're worth maybe 3 to 5 times. As you get over 5 million in EBITDA, you're worth maybe 7 to 9 times. You get over 10 million in EBITDA and you're worth, double digits.
Do you feel like
So
when this happened, you were able to see things from a different perspective of actually seeing the system, like seeing the game and how it works so that you can actually
yeah,
take that game
I
and do it
saw
somewhere else?
how true value is created. Certainly, building a business creates a certain amount of value and working hard every day creates a good living, but the wealth is created when you take the business and look at it as a commodity and you leverage that business in a much bigger platform.
Love that. That's almost one for saying twice. Leverage your business in a much bigger platform, which is really, like what you offer. It's actually a win-win proposition because those sellers actually, when they retain that equity as you did, they can really take that second bite at the apple.
Yes. That second bite of the apple is huge. And it's usually a lot more than you got in the first transaction.
So this first, like the first large exit that you mentioned to Bureau Veritas, that was back in 2002, right?
When I exited PICO, yeah, sounds about right.
Tell me about, I'd like to hear the morning, because that was a complete exit for you. You sold the whole basically conglomerate of US Labs. You had the IPO and then you sold to them. Tell me about the morning after the sale, after you closed. That's like your first reset, because you had your first reset when you sold PICO, but you continued in the organization.
Yeah,
What was that morning like?
I stayed on with US Labs.
We did.
Yeah. Yeah. I didn't exit. I stayed on. I was the chief operating officer of the company. I was the second biggest stockholder in the company. I stayed on to grow the business, help with acquisitions, but mostly integrate operations and troubleshoot operations that need a little help. So, my world, which was South Florida, became a national world. I was overseeing operations in California, in Nevada, and all points in between as we grew the business. And it was a, a great learning experience
How long
to
did you do
operate
it
that
for?
level and to be above. I stayed on with US Labs for probably 2 years. Okay.
Okay.
All right.
And
And
how
then
did the
I
decision come to
exited.
then exit?
What happened?
How did the decision come? Like, when did you decide that, it's
Well,
time for me to
I had a
change?
falling out with Dick Wright.
Okay.
It was primarily over selling some of my stock, which got reported as an inside sale. It kind of pissed him off, and we parted ways. And then at the same time that I was exiting the business, he was in negotiations to sell it to a company called BV, Bureau Veritas. So I'm sure he was the buyer of my stock as it went on the market. And did I exit too early? I would have made more money if I stayed in with the Bureau Veritas tender offer, which took it private. But I made a lot more money than I ever anticipated. And no longer did I have that feeling that I grew up with of survival. I now had enough money in the bank where I felt financially secure.
Gary, did you have that feeling still after you'd done all these great things? Did you live with like that feeling of survival throughout this whole process?
Through the PICO days, after that, I felt financially secure, but I still growing up, with nothing and working for everything I had and knowing what it's like not to have money to put food on the table and to live on green beans and Velveeta cheese. I still have those feelings where I'm very conservative with my money. I'm reasonably frugal. Sure, at my age now, I spend, on important things like family vacations and but I don't live an ostentatious life, but I do take care of my family. And I do make sure that we have wonderful experience together because we don't know how long, we're all going to be here together. So I do
Absolutely.
spend more than I ever did in my life now because I'm now 70 years old and you can't take it
Yeah,
with you.
but it's
And my kids
interesting.
are already set up with
Do you know what's interesting? You're telling me that you
interesting what?
basically left that mentality of survival. You left like that energy of survival. I never would have thought that that kind of stayed with you, throughout almost, you said the Pico days even.
Yeah. Oh yeah. It stays with you.
Wow. So,
When you don't have money and you don't have family to fall back on, and that it's either make it or break it,
mhm.
you always make sure that financial security is upmost in your consciousness.
What is, that brings me to an interesting question is, I wonder if you feel the same way even today, if you have like a little pull in the back of your mind or consciousness kind of telling you, you need to be careful, you need to be safe. Does that still happen to you today?
Yeah,
Wow.
absolutely.
Wow. So it
Which
leads
is
to
a
my
good
next
thing
question.
because
Go ahead. Go ahead.
it keeps you grounded, and it keeps you from doing anything stupid. Because the only way at this point in my life that I'm going to, have to start over again is if I do something stupid. If I make a single purchase, like what I'm doing now, starting from scratch again
Yeah, we'll get to that. We'll get to
and
that.
putting
But I
a fair
wonder,
amount of,
that takes me to like the definition of financial security. We all want financial stability and security, and for some of us, when we've gone through the process, it's like, okay, how can I generate enough passive income to feel safe, right? But then it also took me, and this is a very personal thing, is like, okay, should I not maybe feel safe to then attract that financial security? It's actually an upside down game. I'm just wondering, how do you define today having financial security? What does that mean to you personally?
I define that by having zero debt and a passive income stream that can't go away.
Okay. Well said. Well said. Let's move on to your next stage. Oh, so when you sold, right? You sold the US Labs, basically your shares
I sold it
before.
in the public market.
Okay.
And I
When
had
you
to
did
report
that.
it as an insider. There's a lot of paperwork when selling your shares as an insider and a certain window when you could sell it. So I sold it, right after the earnings reports within those couple of days. And, but Dick and I had a falling out over that. So I left the company and I had a non-compete for 1 year. I went back to Colorado, skied for a year. I had my daughter with me who was about 4 years old at the time. She went into pre-K out in Colorado. At the end of the year, I came back and started another business. Now, this business was unique because I was on a political action committee called the Coalition for Advancement in Plan Review and Inspection. It was a political action committee that was formed between a number of construction industry associations, the Florida Engineering Society, American Society of Civil Engineers, the Associated Building Contractors, the ABC, Associated Building Contractors, there were a number of AIA, American Institute of Architects, a
Hey,
number of industry associations got together and said, well, we can't get any plan reviews or any permits out of Miami-Dade Building Department. We've got to come up with an alternative to the process of waiting 2 years on a building department to issue a permit. So we formed this political action committee, went to Tallahassee year after year, donated to the right campaigns. And after 2 years, Jeb Bush formed a task force for this purpose of figuring out a solution. That task force was chaired by myself and a gentleman named Alan Douglas. I was representing the Florida Engineering Society. He was representing the AGC, Associated General Contractors. And we had a number of building officials on that committee. We had architects. We had everybody in the industry represented. And I came up with the term private provider. And we wrote what's known as the private provider law, which allows fee simple owners of buildings and property to retain an engineer or architect to perform their plan review and inspections on a project, any project that requires a permit, and to certify that plan review and those inspections to the local municipality. And the local municipality has no choice but to accept it. So, that really, back in those days when that law came out, I think it was 2004 or 5 where the law went into effect. At that point, there was so much building going on, particularly in Pasco County, the Tampa area, South Florida, Central Florida. It was just a building boom. And the biggest impediment to the growth that these jurisdictions was experiencing was the inability of these building departments to perform, whether it was because they were just too bureaucratic or they just didn't have the staff to handle this workload. So we, in a matter of a few years, we opened up like 16 offices around the state and became like Kleenex is the tissues.
Mm-hmm.
Capri became the private provider firm in the state. And we grew from 0 to 50, 60 million in volume in under 3 years. And we were just making money hand over fist performing these services because we were establishing the market. We were establishing the fee structures. We were establishing the qualifications for the delegated representatives of the private provider. We established this business and this industry. It's now huge in the state of Florida and has been emulated across the country. And
Yeah,
it
I'm
all
curious.
came out of that task force.
How do you feel your mindset was different to when you were at PICO? You started PICO, you grew PICO as well. It was very successful, but then Capri it's a totally different monster, right? Totally different driving force.
Well, we performed the other services. We did special inspection services. We did construction materials testing. So we did structural design. So we did a lot of the similar services, but what we became known for was the private provided services, where we actually created the market for that and established a business model because I was the author of the law. So when I'd be in the building official's office trying to convince him that this owner doesn't need to use your services, I was the author of the law. So he couldn't tell me that this was not possible because it was possible. And it's something he had to accept whether he liked it or not. Eventually the building departments and the building officials and the inspectors for municipal governments loved it because what this did is create a real competition for their services. Their pay scale doubled overnight as a result of these services because everybody's now competing to hire these people. And they were very much in demand to hire the certified inspectors and plan reviewers.
Nice.
So it became very much in demand. Their pay scale increased dramatically. So all of a sudden this became more acceptable because the building officials realized they still collect their fees, their permit fees. They still have oversight and they don't have to do the work.
Mm-hmm.
The owners like it because they don't have to sit around for years waiting on a permit. They don't have to sit around for days waiting on an inspection. They could tell their private provider inspector to be there at 7 a.m. in the morning to check the reinforcing steel so they could pour concrete at 9. So it gave them much better control over their process. So it's been a very successful thing in the state of Florida. I should get a commission on every private provider job in the state, but I don't. It would have been a wonderful thing. But it's become a big industry.
Yeah, I was going to say you opened up a brand new industry, and I wonder if this actually empowered other states to do the same, right? Because permitting in every state,
Yes. It's in other states, it's called permit and inspection by affidavit. They call it other things, but Texas actually established a similar law. Nevada established a similar law. So there's a lot of offshoots to the private provider law in Florida. And every year the private provider law has improved a little bit. For many years, I had a lobbyist on staff, not on staff, but a retainer that kept an eye on the law, and we tweak it every year. So it just got better and better.
Hmm.
And
Absolutely.
it became big business. Because of that, Capri became very valuable very quickly. I won Ernst & Young Entrepreneur of the Year as a result of that company, Capri. We sold Capri to a private equity group called Stone Point Capital out of Connecticut. That was the owners of Chubb Insurance, Swiss Re. They were a big private equity group run by a guy named Steve Friedman, who was also the previous co-chair or co-president or co-CEO of Goldman Sachs. So these guys are big boys. And his partner, the other co-CEO, was a guy named Bob Rubin, who was the Treasury Secretary previously under, I think, the Bush administration. So these are serious players. They bought our firm because they liked the insurance space. They owned a lot of companies in the insurance space, and they looked at us as a forensic engineering firm that could support their insurance companies.
How did this differ from your first exit in terms of process, in terms of your knowledge of the process? I'm assuming they pursued you and asked to get meetings with you, to set up meetings with you to buy you out. How did the process differ from your first exit?
This one, we had a broker involved
Hmm.
on this one. It was called ESCG. ESCG is the biggest investment banking company in this space. And at the time, it was the only one in the space, Environmental Financial Consulting Group. We had hired them. They called a guy named Don Alford, who was working with Stone Point to start a platform for them in the engineering space. Don Alford worked for me previously. We worked together at US Labs, and we worked together at some point. We worked together at US Labs, so we knew each other very well. As soon as we connected, and it took EFCG one phone call to Don Alford, and a deal was put together. They made a big commission. They made one phone call, and that's great. I don't begrudge them for that. They did their job. They got us sold. They got us sold at a good price. And just prior to that, about 18 months before that, I recapped Capri with a company called Palm Beach Capital.
Okay.
So we recapped with Palm Beach Capital. We were only into the business a year and a half. We recapped at an enterprise value of $28 million, and it was a leveraged transaction with them. And then 18 months later, we sold it for about, the first price was like $77 million, but this was 2007. The market started to weaken really bad. And so by the time we got to the closing table, the transaction was $58 million that they had bought it for, which was a great payday for me as well as for Palm Beach Capital. And as we closed the deal at the end of 2007, you could feel the elevator falling to the ground in 2008 as the market just disappeared.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
eventually that market disappeared. Projects were halted, and the next couple of years was really tough. And
I
Stone
remember.
Point Capital realized that their timing was awful. My timing was great.
Of course.
Their timing was awful. But they were big boys, and they did, for them to write off $60 million, whatever it was that they had in this thing, was nothing. It was just a rounding error for these guys.
Now, for
So-
you, this time around, did you feel that you had more clarity on the process? You had an advisor. Did you go through the evaluator?
I knew very well what I was doing at that point.
Okay.
And I had a 5-year contract with Stone Point Capital. After about 2 years of going through 2008, 2009, they had enough. They actually replaced me, paid off my contract in full. They were very honorable, no problems with them. They paid me off, and they hired my replacement. It was a guy that I introduced him to who was looking for work. His name was Dick Wright. We worked together at US Labs, and he was actually, the CEO of Bureau Veritas in the U.S.
Wow.
He left Bureau Veritas, and I invited him on the board of Capri, introduced him to the Stone Point guys. Stone Point guys fell in love with him. They got rid of me. They brought Dick in, and Dick was just as incapable of turning around this market as I was. So, and he had a lot bigger entourage and a lot more overhead than I had. So they got rid of him after about a year because the loss just became insurmountable for them.
Mhm.
And they just put management in charge. And after another year of that, they ended up selling the whole company that they had paid me $58 million for. They sold the whole company for $1 to the employees. Market turned around right after that transaction. Those employees sold that company for over $70 million 3 years later.
Nice. It came
Yeah,
right back up, huh?
came right back up.
Nice, nice. So what you exit, you left, they paid off your contract.
Yes.
You're on your own. What was on your mind at the time? Because you already had a daughter, right? Your daughter was born. You mentioned you spent the time up in Colorado.
Yeah. Well, at that point now, I think I had two daughters with the same woman who I divorced. I got full custody of both my daughters. So I raised them by myself, took 10 years off. I was the room mom, vice president of PTO. I was one of those dads that showed up. I showed up every day for my daughters,
So hang on.
got them ready for school.
Let, let's go back. So when I know Danielle, because I've been in touch with her, great lady. I mean,
Thank you.
she's amazing. Your other daughter, she was born when?
Brooklyn Elzweig was born in 1997. She's got an engineering degree from CU Boulder and a master's degree from Duke. She's got her own consulting practice, as we spoke about her. She's in the blue economy space, environmental space. And Danielle just about a year ago graduated from Columbia University with her boyfriend, and they're both working for my new company.
Nice, nice.
And the three of them are very bright, very impressive.
Did you ever, when you stopped, before you tell me, because I loved that you took those 10 years to spend time with them. And I mean, kudos to you. And I'm sure you're very grateful to have gotten the time. You worked for it, right? To spend the time with them and to enjoy them as much. When
Yes.
that second, I call it the second reset happened, how did you feel the next day, Gary? I mean, after working through all of that, growing those companies so much and working through the transactions, how did you feel the next morning?
Well, let me say this. If you think raising two daughters by yourself is taking time off, it's not. That was the hardest job I ever had in my life. Okay? That was a job I had to get up 5:30 every morning, get them ready for school, make breakfast, pack lunches, get them to school, and then show up for, PTO things and school events and milestones, and then pick them up from school and do homework with them and, and all what it takes to get them ready for bed and ready for school the next day. So that was probably the hardest job I've ever had. Building multi-million-dollar businesses comes second to raising two daughters.
Wow, wow,
But
wow. Yeah.
it was the most rewarding job I ever had as well, because they're great kids. They're my best friends. I'm proud of them. I love them to death, and they're great kids. They're well-grounded. They're empathetic. They're generous. They know how to work a room because I taught them that. At a young age, I'd bring them in. Like if you see the picture on the wall, that's me. See that? If you zoom in, I got a picture of me accepting the Entrepreneur of the Year award, and my daughter was on stage with me.
Nice.
That little girl there, that was Brooklyn, when she was probably around 11 years old.
Gary, what's your advice? What's your advice? So there's a bunch of entrepreneurs out there, and there's this hustle and grind mentality where you're supposed to kill yourself to grow your business and, make money and make money and make money. What's your advice to all these youngsters out there that are starting to have families, and they just dedicate 99% of their time to their business? I mean, having gone through that yourself, you grew up, basically your parents were not around. What would you tell them right now after you went through it and you see your daughters that really value? Because I've talked to Danielle and she speaks so highly of you. She's your biggest fan.
Thank you.
What would you tell this new generation?
Well, if you're trying to, there's no such thing as balance when it comes to starting a business and being an entrepreneur, because it really takes a lot of effort. It takes 16-hour days, but you have to make time for your family because that's your first priority. You have to take time for your kids, even if that means taking a pause in building your businesses and ascending to greatness. Take that time to make sure your kids are on the right track, because you get out of it what you put into it. So, I gave my kids a lot of love. I gave them luckily I had the resources to give them all the resources they needed to be successful. They were straight A students in school. I made sure that, one of the pivotal moments when they were young was because they were having trouble with their weight, and they were having trouble with nutrition, trouble with self-esteem, like all girls have at a young age. I got them a trainer 3 days a week early on. Come to the house. I have a gym in the house. They would train. And when they were training with her, they were eating well. Their self-esteem shot up. Their grades in school shot up. And to this day, they still work out religiously, and it keeps them on track, focused. And they're great kids. I don't have any kids in rehab, in prison, or none of that. They're all highly educated kids. They're all really good kids, and they're not kids anymore. They're young ladies. They have a lot of integrity. I'd say when you're building your business, treat people right and exceed everybody's expectations. When you're building your business, you have to exceed expectations. You have to do what you say, because as you're building clients, if you take care of your clients with integrity, with diligence, and by working hard for them, they will stay loyal to you. So I had a lot of clients, it didn't matter what company it was, PICO or Capri, I always had their business because, I always did what I said I could do. So, you don't have to burn any bridges. You don't have to step on anybody on the way up. I took care of all my people too, the people that were with me for years. And every deal I did, like when I went from PICO to Capri, the people that came over from PICO to work with me, they all had equity in the firm. And
Nice,
when we
nice. I
and
didn't
when
know
we
that.
when we recapitalized, I gave it about 20% of the business to the staff. And when we recapitalized with Palm Beach Capital, I created a lot of millionaires for people that were working paycheck to paycheck. So, and that's something I really enjoy doing and I value. That's, I'm not one of those guys that's got to take all the chips off the table for himself. It's more rewarding to be able to share that with the people that helped get you there and have worked hard for you and have been loyal. So all those folks participated in that upside. And that's
So,
why you can go.
they say money is an amplifier, and that seems to certainly be the case here. Like money amplifies who you are, and you're a very charitable person trying to build other people up. So kudos to you. That's amazing. What I wonder, what did you learn like from their first experience to the second one? Were there things you learned? Because you're starting to talk about principles, like operating principles in how you run your companies. What were some of the things you learned that heavily impacted your valuation? Like because on the first go round with Pico, you knew very little, right? And you basically went against just a buyer that knew everything. What were some of the things you learned that heavily impacted your valuation, and what did you do to kind of address those
Well, PICO
items?
was a very well-run company. The most important thing you could do to create value in a business is make sure you run it clean. Your financials are clean. You have a good infrastructure that backs up, the growth, the EBITDA growth and the revenue growth. So I have a strong back office. I knew that, just building PICO,
Hmm.
that carried over into Capri, where we had a strong back office. But what I did learn at Capri that I leveraged from my days at PICO was the acquisition. Growing organically and inorganically is a real multiplier. So you could grow your company, 8-10% a year organically, but you could grow it 100% a year through acquisitions.
Good
And
point. Very
and
good
and that
point.
and that's very powerful multiplier, and it creates a lot of excitement in the firm too, because as the firm is growing, it's exciting for everybody. It creates opportunities for everybody, and if people have equity, it's really exciting for everybody. That's why the rollover equity component that I propose in a lot of my deals is so valuable. A lot of people don't look at it that way. They discount it like it's all about the cash in the fist, but it's not. That rollover equity is probably the most important component in any deal, because if you're going to exit, like on my last deal at 18 times, and you roll $2 million and you can walk away with $36 million in 5 years, that's pretty good.
I wanted you to go deeper into that because it's an important topic, and it's one that a lot of people consider valid. When people see an offer, they see it for what it is, cash at closing, and they don't necessarily see the impact this could mean for their future, right?
You know,
Especially when it becomes a new platform where you can actually turn $1 into 8 or into 18, like you're talking about. I think that's a huge, huge distinction. Why do you do it that way? Like, what's your driving force behind taking someone and telling them, hey, come with me, I'll take you to this next level. We'll both win.
yeah. Well, my driving force, my way I sell that is through my personal experiences. I always tell them my first deal was when I sold Pico, 80% of it for 1.5 million. And then a few years later, I sold 20% of it for 8 million. I mean, that's a great comparison right there.
Hmm.
But then the same thing at US Labs. You look at the people that came on with us early and rolled equity. GFA was that first acquisition at UES, and they rolled a few $1 million in equity. And God, it turned into, tens of, multi-millions of dollars, 10, 20, 30 millions of dollars
Wow. Wow.
turned out for
Wow.
those
Wow.
folks, you know?
So we're at the stage here. So Capri, you exit Capri, you sell to Stone Point Capital, right? Back in 2008. You took 10 years. Did you say you took 10 years? That's when you took the
Took
10 years
10 years.
off?
Well, I took 10 years off, but I really didn't take it off.
Okay.
I was still doing consulting, and I bought a few companies out of bankruptcy.
Okay.
2008 took all these high flying companies. There was one company called Quality Built that I tried to buy when I was running Capri,
Mm-hmm.
and they wanted $100 million for the firm. And we offered them like 35 million. And they said, no, we want this firm. The founder, one of the founders, really had these overinflated impression of himself and his business.
Mm-hmm.
And his ego got in the way of him doing a great deal. And what happened was they had a fair amount of debt on the company, which my transaction would have wiped out his debt. And come 2008, 2009, he was in bankruptcy. As opposed to selling it for 35 million, he was now in bankruptcy because they had so much debt, and the company's a great company. So I ended up buying it at bankruptcy for something like $275,000 as they're stalking to us. I ended up getting over $1 million in receivables, over $1 million in IT, and we restructured that firm, got them a big contract with Citizens Insurance here in Florida,
Mm-hmm.
and restructured that company and got them back on their feet. One of the founders, the one with the big ego, left. He sued us, and we eventually settled that for peanuts, but spent a bunch of money on legal fees along the way, which was a total waste. The other founder stayed on with us and did very well. And we made one acquisition. We bought West Coast Property Consultants. They were about to go into bankruptcy as well. So, and then the market turned around. 2010 came, and boom, now the market's back, growing again. It's on fire. And this company that was on the balls of the stairs was now doing very well. I wanted to go back to my easy life of raising the kids and playing tennis. So I ended up selling my interest in Quality Built to a gentleman that was kind of a protege of mine that I brought from US Lab days. He was a minority partner in Quality Built, and I just sold it to him. I did about 10x on that deal, sold to him. He sold the whole company a few years later for like $13 million.
Nice.
And did very well. And now he's a CEO at some other company, and I'm trying to do business with them as well. So even during my hiatus from the industry for 10 years, I made a few deals.
You were active. You were still active.
I was still out there,
But
but
it seems
I
to come
still had the
natural.
mindset of I'm retired, I'm playing tennis, I'm spending time with my kids. So I really didn't get involved too much in Quality Built. Quality Built could have been a lot bigger if I put my mind into it and my shoulder to the wheel. We could have grown that substantially. But, my partner, Brian, was really the operating partner. We had Beth Michaelis, who was who was one of the founders, and they were running it with a little, guidance from me, but very little guidance. And they did well, but it could have been a lot bigger because the market was really growing at that time. After we came out of that recession in 2009 and 2010, the market was on fire after that.
Yeah, it was
So
just
I'm
full of
sitting back and
opportunity.
I'm watching this market and this engineering firm's going for crazy multiples. I'm saying, you know what? Maybe it's time to get back in. My kids are now grown. They were already off to college, and my oldest was off to college already, and my youngest was finishing up high school. I said, I want to go around one more time. And I approached Palm Beach Capital, who I did a deal with previously, and said, I have a few firms that I think we should look at to buy. Let's do this together. And they said, you know what, Gary, if you got a track record with the private equity group, they're going to do whatever it takes to do another deal with you. So we said, okay, let's do another deal. And my 2 deals with them have been historically the 2 best deals they've ever done because 18x return on UES was phenomenal. So
Amazing. That's when you founded Obsidian. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, the company we acquired GFA International.
Mm-hmm.
They were doing about 25 million in revenue at the time, making about 6 million in EBITDA. We bought them, and the company that bought them was called Obsidian Group Acquisitions. The name of the company came from my daughter, Brooklyn. I said, Brooklyn, I need a name of a company to, for this next project I'm working on. So I told her a little about what we're doing. She goes, Obsidian, it's a strong rock. So we named the company Obsidian Group Holdings and Obsidian Group Acquisitions, which is a C Corp, a blocker. We didn't get the qualified small business stock because it didn't apply to business services, but we still were able to control our taxes through our growth by having the C blocker. We bought GFA. After we bought GFA, I went after a company that I was trying to acquire for 20 plus years called Universal Engineering Sciences. They were the 800-pound gorilla in the state of Florida. Nate from Palm Beach Capital, flew up there on a private to Orlando, sat down, had dinner with the 2 owners, and convinced them to sell. And that was something that I was trying to do for 20 years. And once they sold to us, now the company had serious critical mass, and we had established ourselves in the marketplace. And the acquisitions after that came a lot easier after doing those 2 deals.
Yeah, that's when you created. It's basically became a roll-up platform, right? Records indicate you made over 30 acquisitions. Is that right?
Correct.
Wow, that's over. What is this?
3 years. 1 week, I actually closed the deal on a Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday.
And by the way, because you mentioned, so you basically were working with private equity, right? So the
Yes.
deals were capitalized with private equity through private
Well,
equity.
actually, we only put capital in on the first 2 deals. Every other deal after that was senior debt.
Okay. Interesting. And you were able to close all those deals within 1 week, huh?
I closed 3 in 1 week. Yeah. Yeah. And we bought, you know what? We bought all good companies. They were all best in class, great operators, great, founders, and all of them stayed on. And a lot of them stayed on way past their contract because they were excited to be part of a dynamic company like UES that was growing quickly, that was really, we took care of our people, we took care of our clients, and we built a wonderful reputation in the marketplace. We won the Zweig Hot Firm of the Year award 4 years in a row,
I
which is
see it here. Yep.
unprecedented. And
Zweig
it
Hut
was
Firm.
fun. It was a lot of fun. Then we recapitalized it. Was it 2022? We recapitalized it with BDT Capital, Byron Trott. They eventually merged with Michael Dell's company, MSD, and they control the company now. I had a 3-year contract with them. I stayed on for 4.5 years, continued to do their acquisitions, and then it got to a point where it was time for me to exit.
You mentioned good companies. They were all good acquisitions. They were all good companies, more so than just the financials. Is there like a gut factor when you meet a founder and you realize this is a good acquisition and this is a founder I can work with at all?
Yeah, there is a gut feeling, and that's the most important aspect of this. If you got founders that want to continue to stay on and grow their business, and they really care about their business, they care about their people, they're not looking to exit, after the transaction. They're excited about the roll-up equity. They have a vision for growing their business. They just need help with either geographic expansion, service line expansion, or they need help with making some acquisitions and tucking them in and integrating them. Then that's where we come in. We help them grow their business through a number of mechanisms. And we don't come in there and operate their businesses, but we do create economies of scale where they don't have to worry about buying their insurance anymore. Their professional liability insurance, their commercial insurance, their benefits for their people. We created a platform for that on a national basis where a lot of those administrative functions that would keep them from actually doing the work and meeting with their clients and growing the business, we took that off their lap.
I just focus on value added functions.
Value add and take care of those administrative things that keep them from getting out there in the field and meeting with their clients. And we helped them with recruiting. We had a whole recruiting department, helped them with people because that's the only asset engineering firms have is their people. And and you need to really pay attention to retention, and you really need to pay attention to recruiting for those businesses.
Gary, what can you tell us about that last exit you did in 24, the UES exit?
Well, I took a lot of chips off the table at the recap in 22.
Mm-hmm.
We sold 60% of the firm. I had a very sizable payday, stayed on, rolled equity. I've since sold some of that equity after I left in 24 back to the company. But from what I understand they may transact again this year. So I will get the rest of my equity liquidated probably this year. And it'll be a big transaction because now the company's worth over $1.5 billion.
Wow. Wow. So, as you can see, I'm a musician. So I see everything we've been talking about. And I see the music, I see the silence, I see the music, I see the silence, from your active periods to that silence. Silence is very important in music. Without it, there's no melody, right? There's noise if you don't have silence between it. I think this reset periods, and that's why I've been trying to ask you about the resets. You had that important reset of 10 years where you were off and on consulting but spending time with your daughters, which you're right. You were more active than the previous times, but I'm talking business wise. You weren't really completely active, on a 7 to 7 kind of thing. What would you say it's important? I mean, there's something in those periods where, first of all, they teach me and they show me that you're a creator by nature. And we'll get to your latest creation after these. But what would you say those stopping points kind of taught you about yourself and kind of showed you what's next? Because we have a stopping point right now, and you started Wealth Partners now, which is your latest creation.
Hurrah. Yes. What it taught me was I valued the time with my daughters. And I valued the time off because I've been working since I was 12 years old. So I valued the time off to kind of take a breath and pay a little more attention to my physical well-being, lose a little weight, get in shape, played tennis a lot, worked out a lot, time with the kids. It was all quality time, but I missed all the friends I had and friendships and relationships I built up in the industry because they all disappear when you get out of the industry. All those relationships you have with contractors and lawyers and associates and peers and sitting on committees. Because I sat on the Board of Rules and Appeals for 30 some odd years here in Broward County. I chaired a lot of their committees. I chaired the board. So you get away from it, and there's kind of a quiet period where you kind of miss the deal making. You miss being relevant. Even though I was relevant in my daughter's lives,
Of course.
I wasn't so relevant in the industry anymore. But I had a wonderful reputation, and I built a wonderful legacy. So I took a lot of peace from that and fulfillment from that. But you miss the action. There's no doubt about it.
I can see that. Well, tell us, to finish, tell us about Wealth Partners, your latest venture.
Okay, so I had retired now.
Mhm.
It was I left the UES about 1.5 years ago, retired. Really hadn't done anything in 1.5 years other than spend time with a wonderful young lady. That's my fiance. Traveled a lot, spent time with my kids, worked out a lot. And my daughter and her boyfriend graduated Columbia in probably the worst job markets I could ever remember. With everybody laying off now because of AI and because of the efficiencies AI is creating, I'm very astute with AI and I use it a lot. And a lot of this stuff I would call a lawyer for, I do myself with AI now. Business modeling, I do with AI. It creates a lot of efficiencies, but what it's done is it's destroyed the job market for entry-level white-collar jobs. So, Columbia was a great school, but it's a liberal arts degree that you get. And I wouldn't have recommended anybody looking to have a bright future go for a liberal arts degree unless they're sure they're going to go on to graduate school and get a skill. When you go to school for liberal arts, you don't get a skill. You learn how to think. You become more of a Renaissance kind of person. You're well-read. You could talk well at dinner parties on a number of different subjects, but you don't leave with a skill. I recommend kids go to engineering school. They go to business school. They go to medical school. They learn a trade when you come out of college. You get a liberal arts degree, you don't have a trade. You have no skill set. Since then, my daughter and her boyfriend, they went and got a certificate at Wharton in private equity. So they know, what private equity is all about. But they're both very bright. They needed an opportunity. So I said, okay, I'm coming out of retirement. I'm going to teach you the family business, which is how to buy companies and how to take those companies and build incredible value.
Mhm.
I said, well, we got to find an industry that is fragmented and ripe for consolidation. We got to find an industry that is growing and is driven by statutory and regulatory requirements as opposed to discretionary spending. And we got to find an industry where it's not picked over yet, where the financial buyers and the strategic buyers hasn't already taken all the low-hanging fruit. So we came up with concrete restoration.
Nice.
It's a strong market here in Florida because of the milestone law. It's a fragmented business, a lot of mom and pop operations, no major player in this space. The buyers are not in yet like vultures,
Mhm.
like in engineering space. There's so many buyers in engineering
Yep.
that people are paying crazy multiples for mediocre firms. But in the concrete restoration space, there's a lot of room for consolidation and there's a lot of opportunity for value creation. And I think timing is very important when you do what I do, which is rolling up companies. And I think the timing is perfect right now for this space. The only impediment right now in this space is all these companies are doing so well. They don't want to sell.
Mm.
I had a great deal that went sideways on me 2 weeks ago after we were down to the short strokes. Guy said, I'm having my best year ever.
Mm.
Why do I want to sell now?
Yeah,
Come
but
see me in 2 years.
But by the way, that's exactly when you want to sell as a seller, when you're having
That's
your
exactly
best
what
year
you want to
ever.
sell.
That's exactly
You
what you want
know?
to do. What's your end game with this? And by the way, it's very honorable that you're passing this on to your daughter. That's quite the legacy that you're passing on. So more so than your financial legacy, just passing on this knowledge of you figuring out. Because when I see your story from the top, I see that you figured out that game. You figured out how to add the most value and make these companies extremely valuable and share that with others, by the way, which is great. What's your end game with this one? Do you have a plan as to,
Well,
acquire
because
so
we're
many?
a qualified small business stock, we have to be in it for at least 3 years
Mhm.
because you get 50% at 3 years as far as federal tax exclusion. At 4 years, you get 75%. At 5 years, you get 100% federal tax exclusion on 10 times your capital investment for the initial transaction. So the first company that comes in, their rollover equity, let's say they roll $4 million or $3 million in the case that we're talking about. When they exit, and let's say they exit at 10x, we exit at 10x, their $3 million is now worth $30 million, and it'll be excluded from federal taxes. So normally where you'd be giving up 10 million of that 30, you're not giving up nothing, which is a wonderful value add. So I see us being in this thing for at least let me say this. I might not be in it for 3-5 years, but my daughter will be in it because this is not the only vertical they want to build. After we get this vertical built, they'll probably start another vertical. So they're now, because of the way we set this up and the knowledge I'm sharing with them, they're in the private equity business, and they're young, and they're smart, and they're well capitalized, and they're building on my legacy. So I see them taking this private equity firm throughout the next 30 years and creating some serious value, maybe on the order of KKR. Who knows? Those guys started with less money than we're starting with and with less knowledge. And they're a multi-billion-dollar firm. And there's a lot of private equity firms that are very large, making a lot of money. And it's all a matter of being in the right space at the right time and not trying to be everything to everybody. Because a lot of these private equity firms, they'll buy a company that's, a grocery chain, and they'll buy a medical services company, and they'll buy an engineering company. They're all over the place. My philosophy is kind of stick with what you know. And because when you stick with what you know, you're really able to add value to those companies because you know
100%,
the space.
100%. What would you tell a seller? Because you're going to find many sellers that are going to be on the fence, as you said, not just because their business is booming, but because they're kind of on the fence. They're ready to retire, but they're not. Usually when people start getting ready is when you want to talk to them, when they get this nudge that they need change in their life and they need to get ready for their next stage in life. What would you tell so that they're aware?
Here's what I would say to them. First thing, make sure your back office is clean, professional, and easily verifiable. Your numbers are easily verifiable. Don't tell me about all the personal expenses you run through the business and the girlfriend you have on payroll and your kids are driving company cars. All that stuff, when you have to add back, when 80% of your EBITDA is add backs, it's just a red flag, and it really takes away from the value of the business. I would say run your business clean. Make sure those financials are solid, and make sure your back office is solid. I would also tell them that do not expect to exit in one move. At a minimum, if you want to get true value for the business, you're going to have to exit in 2 to 3 moves. That means there's no such thing as taking the money and run, because that company will get discounted. Because most buyers are not interested in running your business. They're interested in building your business with you at the helm. So don't plan on going anywhere anytime soon. But as you get bigger, it's easier for you to step away as you put in place succession plans while you're part of a bigger organization that could fill the gaps. But if you're a mom and pop operation and you think you're just going to take the money and go, then you're going to be getting 20 cents on the dollar for that business.
A big discount. Yep.
Yeah.
And finally,
no one wants to come in there and run that business.
What's that?
No one wants to come in there and run your business.
Yeah, no one's
They want to grow your business. And I would tell them also not to give ample consideration to the company that's buying you, their track record, and what that rollover equity could grow into.
Yeah, because I guess once if your company's still kind of on the smaller side, then yeah, you do have the opportunity to sell to an operator that's going to take over. However, when you get to this gray area between large company and well-established companies and those small ones is when you're in between, and when you can probably capitalize the most, when you're in like that beginning or the lower middle market level.
Yeah. And at that level, when you're so small that you're looking to sell to an operator, it's like almost an ESOP. You're going to have to finance the sale because they don't have that kind of money.
Yeah. Good point.
Skill set and a fair amount of resources, they can start their own business. Why do they want to buy your business?
Very true. Gary, finally, if you could go back to that young guy in the 80s starting his first company, what would you do differently with what you know today?
I would tell that guy from 1995, I think, when I sold my first company, I would say, don't undervalue your business and don't sell too early. Okay. And, I've sold property too early. I have, but there's an old saying, you never go broke taking a profit. And, I'm a big believer in leaving something on the table for the next guy. Everybody wants to squeeze every dime out of a deal, but you want somebody that's going to come in and buy your firm and do well. But if you try and squeeze every penny out of it and try and get 6 to set, and I'm dealing with that on another transaction right now. where they think, the founders are in their 70s. They want to exit early as soon as possible, and they want 6X for the business. It's going to take me 6 years to make that money back, or maybe longer, because I got founders that got one foot out the door. So, I would tell that Gary from back then. I would say, sometimes in some of your deals, hold on a little longer. Don't sell so quick. But I've had, yeah, and I not so much with the companies. My time has been pretty impeccable with the businesses I've built and sold. It's more real estate, anything in my life. And I probably would tell that guy not to marry my second wife for the third time. Okay, that was very expensive.
We'll get to those topics. I was going to end with, I look forward to hearing what you've done with Welts along with Danielle and her boyfriend. I know you guys are going to be extremely successful, but I'm
Thank you.
excited to have you back and report in maybe a couple years what you guys have built. But we definitely, I think we need plenty of interviews to go through the different layers that you've talked about, because it's not just about the deal. It's about your personality, how you became someone else, how you went through parenthood on your own. There's so many aspects that I wanted to ask you about. But I really appreciate your time. We're getting on an hour and a half, and all I can say is thank you, Gary. It was a pleasure having you here, and I look
My
forward to
pleasure.
having you again. Have a great day. Till next time.